Right. Welcome everyone to today's training on how youth sports and after school programs can prevent child sexual abuse. My name is Kelsey Alexander. I'm with the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and thank you for joining us. We are nearing the end of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and it has been great to see folks from different types of communities, different types of organizations and workplaces showing up to some of our trainings to get more engaged in sexual violence prevention. April is a great time to be doing that. So we're excited to have everybody here, and anybody who's tuning in watching the recording of this, thank you for doing that as well. So this is what we're going to cover today. You can see from all the different bubbles on the screen, we've got a lot of stuff to go through. So I'm going to just jump right in and show you in a little bit more detail what my goals are for today. So first of all, I'm going to just briefly go over the sexual violence resources that exist in Connecticut. Not everybody is super familiar with these resources. If you are working for a youth sports league or an after school program or something like that, that's not the main focus of today's training, because today we're really focused on prevention, but we do want everyone to know how they could support someone, what resources they could offer to somebody who's a victim or survivor of any kind of sexual violence. So we'll spend just a minute or two on that. You all are going to think about your personal and workplace connections to the issue of child sexual abuse. This is all about building a little bit of our own intrinsic motivation for taking this issue really seriously and taking concrete steps to addressing it. I'm going to share some opportunities specific to the youth sports and the after school space, things that we can do to make those environments safer for kids. And we'll just discuss some next steps for bringing child sexual abuse prevention into your workplace. And my other caveat for today is that this is not a training on mandated reporting or any of the laws in Connecticut related to child sexual abuse. You can find great trainings on that. I can share a resource at the end of the training today if anybody's looking for a good training on mandated reporting. That's just not what we're going to cover today. So I just wanted to say that at the top. Of course, being a mandated reporter is a really important role to play, and it might affect some of the things that you see, like some of the conversation topics we have today, but we just don't have time to get into all of that. Please take care of yourself however you need to during the next hour. Step away if you want. I will hang out at the end for a little while if anybody wants to just be in touch with me a little bit more. Obviously, we are going to be talking about child sexual abuse today, which is a really upsetting and a personal topic for a lot of us. So take care of yourself, do whatever you need to. And in that regard, just so that we can all be on the same page, I think audiences often have like varying levels of familiarity with what child sexual abuse actually is. So these are a few examples or a few definitions. I'll read these out loud. This is not the end-all be-all definition of what child sexual abuse is, but this is, I think, a pretty straightforward way to understand it and think about it. So child sexual abuse is any interaction between a child and an adult, or a child and another child, in which the child is used for the sexual gratification of the perpetrator or an observer. One thing I do just want to highlight from this sentence, I think a lot of us think of child sexual abuse as something that is primarily perpetrated by adults against children. And there is a lot of cases like that. There are many instances like that happening in our communities. It is also very common that children are victimized by other children. Often the other child might be older, have more power than them in some way. There is still a power dynamic similar to what we might see with like a child and an adult. But I just wanted to highlight that we are talking about, when we think about prevention, it's not just about how do we prevent adults from harming children, but how do we prevent children from harming each other? Sexual abuse can include both touching and non-touching behaviors. And some of those non-touching behaviors could include voyeurism, which would be trying to look at or maybe record with a phone or a camera some part of a child's body, or exhibitionism, which is like showing parts of your own body to a child or exposing the child to pornography. So none of those things necessarily involve physical contact. They are still considered child sexual abuse. Does anybody have any questions about that before I move on? I'm guessing from our audience who we have today, this is all very familiar information. Okay. Throughout the conversation today, if anybody has questions, you can unmute yourself and just jump in. You can put something in the chat. You can do whatever feels most comfortable. All right, so ever so briefly, what resources do we have in Connecticut? Regardless of the town you live in Connecticut, and this is true of many other states, if you happen to be watching this recording and you live in another state besides Connecticut, I would encourage you to look up your sexual assault crisis centers or your sexual assault coalition. Probably you will find a similar looking map where every single part of the state is covered. There are in Connecticut 9 sexual assault crisis centers that support all victims and survivors of all different kinds of sexual violence. Here are some of the resources and services that these agencies provide. They run 24/7 sexual assault crisis hotlines. I'm going to give you the hotline information in just a second. Those hotlines are staffed by certified sexual assault crisis advocates in the state of Connecticut. They answer questions. They can provide crisis counseling over the phone. They can get people connected to additional resources that might be helpful to them. Our English hotline in Connecticut is now also available for text, and we have a chat feature on our website that I'll show you that information in just a second as well. The sexual assault crisis centers in Connecticut also do a lot of community and prevention education. This is, I think, a really great opportunity for partnership between after-school programs, youth sports leagues, and sexual assault crisis centers, is maybe to start having conversations with the prevention educators at those organizations, because they can do even more training than what we're going to cover in just the next hour, and really help you think about how are you doing meaningful prevention work within your after-school sports setting. The advocates that work for all of the sexual assault crisis centers in Connecticut, in addition to answering the hotline, they do medical, police, and court advocacy and accompaniment. So that means responding if a survivor goes to an emergency department to have a forensic exam or a rape kit done, they can have an advocate with them for the duration of that process, or just to ask some questions before or after. They can assist somebody who wants to file a police report or who needs to go to a police department to take part in an interview or anything like that. And similarly, if somebody does end up needing to go to court to show up for hearings, or if something goes to trial, they can also have an advocate from their sexual assault crisis center be present with them for all of that. All of these services are free. They are all confidential. They're available for anybody in the state who is a survivor or a victim of sexual violence, including people who were harmed many, many years ago, but are seeking some support right now, still eligible for services. Advocates also provide short-term supportive counseling. So this is different from therapy. They oftentimes will refer folks to a therapist in the community if somebody wants to have a more long-term, like ongoing therapist relationship. But this short-term supportive counseling is really designed to help folks get out of crisis or like move through the crisis process. Our member centers offer support groups, in many cases, support groups for specific groups of people, sometimes based on identity. So they may offer an LGBTQ specific support group, or a support group that is held in Spanish, or a support group for men. And then lots and lots of information about, you know, what's going to happen if I file a police report, what's going to happen if my case, if it does end up going to trial, or if I have to go to court. Just answering a lot of questions. and referring people to other services in the community that might be beneficial to them. And the best way for anybody in Connecticut to get access to these services is to call the hotline. I'm going to leave this up here for just a second in case anybody is not familiar with what the hotline numbers are in Connecticut. You can take a picture of this or put it in your phone. And I mentioned that we also have chat services. This is on the Alliance's website, which is endsexualviolencect.org. The chat and text services are only available at the moment, Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. And as I mentioned before, we have a hotline that is operated in English and one that's run in Spanish. We obviously have a lot of people that call hotlines who speak a different language. So if somebody calls the English hotline and needs a language besides English or Spanish, they will get connected to a translator or an interpreter through Language Line. So people can utilize that service and have a conversation in whatever language they need. All right, I'm going to move us on from services. I know that's kind of quick, but we have a lot of other stuff to cover today. Okay. So we're going to spend a few minutes thinking about our own personal connection to the issue of child sexual abuse. And if you have a piece of paper and a pen near you, if you have your phone and you want to open up like the Notes app on your phone, I'm not going to ask anyone to share this information, but I want you to just spend a few seconds thinking about why do you care, you personally, not, the organization that you work for. We're going to talk about that in a second. Why do you, the individual, care about preventing child sexual abuse? For a lot of people, it's because we ourselves are survivors, or it's because we know somebody who's a survivor. You may have a very different reason. You may just feel like this is an issue that you don't want happening in the community that you live in, that child sexual abuse causes trauma to people that lasts for a really, really long time. And nobody should have to go through that. And so that personally is really motivating to you to care about this issue. So spend a few seconds writing down whatever your personal connection is to this issue. That's going to help us keep that in mind for the rest of today's conversation. Okay. So now we're going to think about the audience that we are focusing on today, which is youth sports and after school programs. Why should they care about preventing child sexual abuse? So if you work for a program like this or a league or an organization like this, you can think about your own workplace and like, why do the people there, or why does the organization itself care about this issue? If you don't work for an organization or a program like that, then just think about, like logically or hypothetically, why should people who work in this kind of field care about preventing child sexual abuse? And actually, we're going to share our answers to this question. Once I can get there we go. We're going to share this on using a Jamboard. So we did this yesterday. If you were with me yesterday, if you have not used Jamboard before, it's really easy. You can click on the link that I just put in the chat, and it will take you to a page that has a question at the top, which is the question that I just asked you all, and then just a bunch of white space below it. If you look on the left, there is a little bar that has a sticky note there's a bunch of different icons on there. One of them looks like a sticky note. If you click on that, it'll pop up the sticky note. You can write your answer to that question. And then when you click done, it will show up on the screen and everybody will be able to see it. Your answers are anonymous though. We can't see who is typing what answers, and your name won't show up anywhere on the screen. But I would love everyone, if you have thoughts about the answer to this question, to put them up on the screen just so we can get a whole bunch of people's responses. Why should youth sports and after school programs care about preventing child sexual abuse? If anybody has any questions about how to do this, or if you're having any difficulty like navigating the Jamboard, let me know. Cool. Seeing some answers come in. That's awesome. So the answers I'm seeing so far are, it's a great time to teach a child to think critically, to have positive relationships with others, and build self-confidence. It's a time when children might disclose things occurring outside of school, such as abuse at home, to a trusted adult. Sports can be a safe outlet for children. There's been a prevalent history of coaches grooming their players/athletes. It's a time to teach about self-esteem. These are all great answers. Perfect. Pull this back up. Feel free to keep adding to that if you're still thinking or still writing. A lot of what you shared is exactly what you will see on my next slide here. So these are a few of the reasons that I came up with. Why should you care? Why should youth sports and after school programs care about this issue? So as somebody pointed out, children can be harmed or abused by adults or other children in the program. We do know that this happens sometimes. There's certainly news stories from our own communities, I'm sure most of us can think of instances where a coach, an assistant coach, or maybe an older player harmed a child in some way. I'm saying coach and assistant coach, which sounds mostly like the sports league sort of thing, but the same can be true of just general after school programs as well, right? Employees working in these programs might be survivors themselves, or they might have survivors in their friend group or their family. Stories in the news can affect how employees and families feel about these kinds of programs. So when there's a lot of stories coming out all at once sometimes about, I know I'm not going to remember it like accurately enough to really, I don't remember when this happened, but you know, for a while, I think that we were seeing a lot of news stories about like the Boy Scouts, that there had been abuse happening in like Boy Scouts programs from years ago. And even if none of the stories were super current, that can affect how people who are like thinking about putting their kid in the Boy Scouts or potentially work for the Boy Scouts, like it can affect how people feel about being a part of those programs. Somebody in the group today pointed out that kids in programs might be survivors. They might be disclosing some of that information to their peers or to the staff that work in these places. And certainly if we know of a specific incident that happened in a league or an after-school program, that could affect the reputation of that particular program for a long time. So these are just some of the reasons. I think you all came up with a few others that we could add to this. Just again, trying to build a little bit of the motivation for why are we here today and why is this an issue we should spend some time thinking about. So now we're going to think about our values a little bit, and we're going to start with our personal values. We're starting always with our own personal motivation and interest in this issue, and then moving to thinking about our workplace or our program that we are a part of. And this is a question I would love to have folks answer either in the chat, or you could unmute and share out loud. What values or beliefs do you hold that make preventing child sexual abuse a priority? This is a little bit different from thinking about your personal connection to the issue. Your personal values could apply to a lot of different issues, right? To give an example, one thing that I believe is that we should protect kids. Like, we should try to keep kids safe and healthy. Like, that's what they deserve. That is what adults are responsible for doing. That's a value of mine, or a belief of mine, that makes me care about preventing child sexual abuse. It also makes me care about things like making sure kids wear seatbelts in the car, and I don't know, making sure kids know how to have healthy relationships with their peers. Like, it bleeds into a lot of other areas of my life, but it is definitely related to preventing child sexual abuse. So can anybody think of your own personal values or beliefs that help you want to prioritize preventing child sexual abuse? You can put those answers in the chat or unmute and share. One great one that came in on the chat is that children should be protected from harm. Absolutely. I think that's something that probably everybody who's here today believes. And I just think it's good to name these things out loud, because we're not always aware. You know, some of these things just feel so natural to us, or so like intrinsic to who we are, that we're not always that explicit about naming them out loud. And as we're going to see in the next section of the training, saying these things out loud and finding ways to communicate our values to the people around us, that's part of preventing child sexual abuse. Some other ones that you might be thinking of, or that might resonate for you, are belief in things like bodily autonomy, that everybody, including children, should get to be in charge of what happens to their own body, and that nobody else should be making decisions or preventing people from having control over their own body. I see one in the chat about preventing cycles of abuse in future generations. Absolutely. Knowing that somebody's trauma could affect them for the rest of their life, and so wanting to prevent that. Great. Yeah, great answers. So let's shift now away from thinking just about ourselves, and now think a little bit about workplaces, specifically youth sports and after-school programs. What values or beliefs do these kinds of programs hold, implicitly or explicitly, that make preventing child sexual abuse a priority? And I have a few prompts on the next slide. This is also going to be a question in the Jamboard. So if you've still got the Jamboard open, at the top, you can click, there's a little arrow that'll click over to slide number 2. There's a new question at the top, and you're going to answer that one as well. These are some questions to sort of get you thinking about how do I know what my after school program or my youth sports league, like, what are their values? What conversations or topics come up repeatedly in meetings or check-ins or debriefs? You know, one thing I'll say about like sexual assault crisis centers, for example, since I know we've got a bunch of folks from those agencies here today, I'm guessing that many of your agencies have a lot of conversations about self-care, right? Comes up in staff meetings, comes up in individual supervision. You probably get emails about it occasionally. That means that your program values self-care, or that's one thing that your program might value, your agency might value. How do the staff working in these programs want kids and families to feel about the program? And how do leadership want the staff or the volunteers to feel while they're working? What sorts of campaigns or initiatives have these programs done? Who have they partnered with? What sort of training have they brought in for staff and volunteers? And even things like, you know, the name of an after-school program, or if they have a slogan, if they have a logo, if it's a sports league, like, what are the names of all the teams? Like, all of that stuff actually gives us some information about what this program values. So I'm going to just click over to the Jamboard and see if we're getting any answers on that. Okay, see one, it says the importance of building a belief in bodily autonomy from a young age. Yeah, I think there's programs, including after school programs, youth sports programs, that are really concerned with like kids knowing they can be in charge of their own body. That is a value. It feels really relevant to me when I think about sports, because I assume, I've never been a coach, but I assume that part of being like a good coach or assistant coach or anybody who is guiding a kid through being a member of a team or getting better at a sport is about like teaching kids to listen to their own body and to know their own body well, so that they don't get hurt, so that they're not like pushing themselves way too hard and they're going to injure themselves, and just so they can be a better player. So like knowing about your own body, listening to your own body, that's really connected to bodily autonomy. I see another one that says learning to communicate and work with others in a team environment, which builds positive life skills. Yeah, that collaboration, cooperation, teamwork is a value that we can also apply to thinking about how do we prevent child sexual abuse. That's great. A few other ones that come to mind for me, I'm guessing that any type of program that works with kids has safety as a value. Nobody ever wants to see a kid get hurt in any kind of way when they are like playing a sport, participating in an after school program, right? That could be scary and very disruptive to the program. So I'm guessing safety is a value that a lot of these types of organizations care about. I'm going to just add that to the Jamboard. We can think of others, but I want to keep us moving here. The reason we're talking about values, and we're going to shift in just a second to thinking about not just our values, but then what is the actual culture at some of the places that we work, or, you know, maybe you don't work there, but we're thinking hypothetically about a youth sports or an after school program. Because our values are the things that we know, like we feel internally, we might even talk about them, but if there's not visible, like tangible things that people can see or can hear, or they can feel when they're with us or they're in this particular space, they're like going to the after school program or they're going to practice or to a game or whatever, then knowing our own values doesn't really help us change anything about the culture around us, because we haven't communicated them to everybody else. So that is what we're going to think about next. And this falls into the category of proactive prevention of child sexual abuse. We're also going to talk about reactive prevention, which is more like, I think a kid really is at risk of being harmed, and what am I going to do about it? Proactive prevention is all of the things that we are going to do ahead of time at the start to make sure we never ever get to a place where a kid is potentially being harmed. So I think of this with this idea of setting norms. So if your program has a physical space, if it's an after school program that operates out of a community center or a school or a church or, you know, some other public space, how people feel and how people treat one another while they're there, this includes employees or volunteers, as well as any of the kids that are participating in the program. You can, as a leader, as an employee potentially of an organization like this, help guide how people behave and how people treat one another while they're in these spaces. And that can help us make it less likely that kids experience any kind of sexual harm while they're in a space like this, if we think about and we're really intentional about the culture that we build. So the question I'm asking here is, what is your workplace culture? And another way to think about that is, how will the people, so for this question, I'm thinking more about like employees and people who work for or volunteer for after school programs or youth sports programs. How will they know what is acceptable or typical behavior when it comes to how people treat one another in this kind of space, or how people do their job. And that we can include for our conversation today, if sort of we think about like bystander intervention, potentially, if somebody sees a situation where a kid might be at some risk, like, is it acceptable for the adult to intervene in that place? Is it expected for them to do that, or is it not? Do people sort of mind their own business and like try not to get involved? So this is kind of a big question. I'm going to give a few examples here, and then if people have other things to add to it, we can put that in the chat, or you can share out loud. So how do we know, as employees or volunteers for programs like these, what is acceptable or typical when it comes to how people treat one another? Here's a few examples. So there's the physical space. I think about things like if there's like a staff break room somewhere, there's a place where staff tend to hang out when they're not working. Are there things on the walls in that room, or is there anything in that room that is serving as a reminder of like, we really care about kids in this space. We want kids to be safe. We believe it is adults' responsibility to protect children and keep them safe. That's a value that the program probably has. One way they could communicate it is by thinking about their physical spaces and putting something up as a reminder to people. What sorts of partnerships do these programs have? Are they actively partnering with their local sexual assault crisis center? If they're not, that's a real great opportunity to start building that partnership, and to communicate to staff and volunteers, and probably to the families who send their kids to these programs. This is something that we really care about. We care about preventing child sexual abuse. That's why we're working with our local sexual assault crisis center. Things like training topics, if staff have been like mandated to go to a particular training, and then policies as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about policy today. Policies that outline explicitly, like, this is how people should be treating one another, or this is what's expected. Great in terms of informing people about the culture, but also things that are mandated are not going to fully solve the entire problem, right? Like, I'm sure many of us have attended a training or like signed off that we read a handbook of some kind, but if some of the things that we learned about or that were in the handbook, it doesn't seem like people actually care about, or there's not really any enforcement of those things, they're not going to become part of the culture and part of the norms, just because they're written down somewhere. What conversations are people having with one another, just casually or in meetings or things like that? What sorts of events is the program doing? That speaks a lot about their priorities. And then digital spaces. If an organization, a program, a league has a social media account, has a website, sends out email communication to people, what kinds of things are they sharing? Are they communicating that keeping kids safe and preventing child sexual abuse is a priority? Because those are really good opportunities to do that. Can anybody think of anything else you'd add to this list? Like, what else shows the culture of an organization? All right, I'm going to move to the next one. This is kind of a similar idea. So the previous slide was all about how employees behave and how people who work for these or volunteer for these organizations behave. This is more about, what about like the kids and their families who are part of these programs? How are they going to know what kind of behavior is acceptable, how people should be treating one another? So some similar ideas to the previous question, but a few other ones. Staff behavior. So, if families or kids, maybe especially like older kids, teenagers, observe how staff treat one another, they're going to pick up something about the culture or about like what's okay for them to do based on how the staff behave or how the staff interact with the participants of the program. Instead of policies, we might think about codes of conduct for kids or for families. I know sometimes in sports leagues, there are codes of conduct for parents and families who are maybe showing up to watch games, and like people don't want the parents being aggressive on the sidelines or getting really angry at the coaches or the kids or the other team or whatever. That code of conduct communicates what are the priorities of this sports league, right? And then stuff like merch or swag or any sort of like physical, tangible thing that is being given to participants. If everybody in an after school program gets a t-shirt, what kinds of images are on that t-shirt? What kind of logo or slogan is on the t-shirt? All of that communicates, or is an opportunity to communicate, the values and the culture of this organization. So here's where we get into some of the things that I hope proactively some of the youth sports and after school programs in Connecticut and everywhere will start to think about doing if they're not doing these things already. So firstly, all organizations that are supervising children, working with children in any way, need to have policies that explicitly outline appropriate interactions between children and staff. And then those policies need to be widely known to the staff, the participants, and families. So a few things that I would consider including in a policy like this is what type of communication or what like forms of communication are considered appropriate between the adults in the program and the kids in the program. So for example, if we're talking about an after school tutoring program, do the adults, like the volunteers, the staff members who work in the tutoring program, do they have the cell phone numbers of the kids? If the kids are old enough to have cell phones, like, do they get to text the kids if the program is canceled for the day, or if they need to move to a different location for that day or whatever? Or are they only allowed to text the parents or the adults in the situation, right? One of the things you'll see as we get into the next section that we really recommend in terms of preventing child sexual abuse is trying to eliminate or reduce one-on-one isolated situations between adults and kids, or even kids with one another, particularly if there's a big power difference between the kids. So an adult in a program, a coach, a tutor, whoever, just texting a kid, I would recommend having a policy that says that's not really okay. The policy could say, if we need to be doing communication over text message for some reason, that it can include the child, but it also needs to include one of the parents, so that there's some transparency around what all this communication looks like, right? Some other things to consider: how are participants being transported? If there's any sort of needing to travel to different places as a part of this program, is it ever okay for a staff member to be driving students or transporting students somewhere? Again, thinking about those like one-on-one situations where there's potentially some risk. How are areas like locker rooms or changing areas being monitored? I think we, in some cases, think, well, it's really not appropriate for an adult to be monitoring a locker room because there's kids changing, and that maybe doesn't feel good to have an adult who is not their family member in the area. But we do need to consider that these areas are also potentially places where kids might be harming one another. And so we do need some kind of supervision. So what is that going to look like? And a few other suggestions. Make your program's values known to everyone. Come up with creative ways to share these values, to display them on posters on the walls, to put them into emails that go out to all the families, to put them on your social media. Communicate these things over and over and over again and work on living up to them. That is going to help staff, volunteers, participants, families, everybody be really bought into these ideas. Celebrate whenever somebody does a really great job of, say, for example, there's an after school program and a staff member observes a kid really trying to model like consent with one of their peers, right? They ask the kid before giving them a hug or something like that. Celebrate that. That's really, really cool to see kids behaving in a way that we know is going to help keep them safe. We can highlight that and share that with everyone. And then build ideas like respect, safety, consent, and bodily autonomy into kids' activities and training opportunities for staff. After-school programs and youth sports leagues are great opportunities to just be really creative about the types of projects, games, whatever we're doing with kids in these spaces. And we can use these values, these things that we really care about, that we also know are going to prevent child sexual abuse. We can just build that right into all the fun stuff that we're doing with kids in these spaces. Any questions? I'm gonna pause for a sec because I know I've been talking a ton. Does anybody have any questions or comments about anything? All right, I'll keep an eye on the chat, but I'll keep us moving. Okay, so that was proactive prevention. Now we're going to talk a little bit about reactive prevention, or you might think of this as like intervention a little bit more. And this is when we, as adults, see a situation that does feel potentially risky or harmful to us. And we, first of all, need to be able to recognize it, but also then need to know how are we going to handle it to keep a kid safe. So really what we are focused on for this section is the idea of grooming. So for anybody who might not have heard the word grooming in this kind of context before, this is something that folks in the anti-sexual violence field are pretty aware of. It's something that we've in Connecticut been creating more like legislation and policy around the last few years. So I'll just read what's on the screen here. Grooming is a tactic where someone methodically builds a trusting relationship with a child, their family, and their community to manipulate, coerce, or force the child to engage in sexual activities. The person doing the grooming identifies vulnerabilities, erodes the child's boundaries, and builds up to acts of sexual abuse, all while convincing everyone around the child that the child is safe. So we know, working in the anti-sexual violence field, that grooming is often the precursor to child sexual abuse. So when adults are able to recognize grooming and intervene, we can prevent child sexual abuse. This is a moment of great importance for adults to be noticing things and stepping in and really potentially keeping kids safe and preventing them from experiencing trauma. So what does grooming look like? These are a few examples. I'm not going to read all of them. They're reflective of the definition that I shared on the previous slide. But generally, building this could be done by an adult. This could be done by an older child. I would not say it is typical for children who are just maybe like 1 or 2 years apart for us to see this kind of thing, but really we might be talking about like a teenager with a kid who's in like elementary school, or a child who is almost an adult with a kid who's much younger than them. So doing things to isolate the child, to build sort of a private, secret relationship with them, even though the child's family might be well aware that this adult and this child have some sort of relationship, or that this older child and a younger child have some sort of relationship, and not feel any kind of concern about it, because the grooming also happens to the family members. It is very intentional on the part of somebody who is trying to sexually abuse a child to come off as very trustworthy, probably very charismatic, very caring, and just somebody who like really understands this child and wants to have a good, trusting relationship with them and their family. So adults can notice some of the things we see on the screen here. And I totally agree with the comment that I'm seeing in the chat right now, which is that not enough adults and parents are educated on this topic. I 100% agree. We are trying to do a lot more of this because ultimately, especially when we're talking about younger kids, but this includes teenagers as well, adults need to be responsible for keeping kids safe. We do care about, kids having good relationships with their peers and knowing how to say no and how to express their own boundaries and advocate for themselves. But when it comes to like a power differential between an adult and a child, or just a kid who has a lot more experience or power or whatever than a younger child, we cannot expect kids to keep themselves safe. That's just the reality of preventing child sexual abuse. So I agree. I think it's really important that like every adult in every community knows what this looks like and is able to intervene, which is what it says on this slide as well. So what might intervening look like? I will say this is the very beginning of this conversation. We could talk about this for hours, like just how are adults going to step in and what is intervening going to look like in these kinds of situations. We will at some point probably do a much longer training on that. Today is really just an overview. Here's some things that you could do, that any adult working in an after-school program, a youth sports league, a parent, anybody who interacts with kids in any way, some things you could do. You could check in with the child to see if they're okay, if they need help. But remember, you don't actually need their permission to intervene. There's a lot of reasons why a kid might defend a person or just not really know that what's happening to them is potentially harmful, or that it's building up to something harmful. So you as the adult, you have to trust your instinct and decide to intervene, even if a kid says, no, I'm fine, this is just how things are, like, it doesn't bother me. You can very explicitly set boundaries on behalf of the child. So one example I have of this is somebody could say, I'm not comfortable with you taking Kyle to the gym while everyone else is outside. He needs to go outside with the rest of the group. Very simple. The good thing about doing this kind of thing is that it's not necessarily even explicitly saying like, I'm worried that you're grooming Kyle or that you're potentially going to sexually abuse Kyle. It is just addressing the issue in the moment and removing the child from the potentially harmful situation. And it leaves a little bit of room of like, if you're wrong about it, it's okay. The kid is just, he's going to go outside. He's going to be fine. We've avoided this like one-on-one situation. And it doesn't matter if you're wrong about what's really going on there, like no harm has been done. You can decide to also more explicitly just speak up and say that you've seen some things that you're not okay with and that they need to stop. You could say that to an adult, you could say that to an older child, just really directly pointing out, these are the behaviors I'm noticing. I noticed you had this child sitting on your lap. That's not okay. We don't do that. If your program has policies, which it should, you can talk about those policies. That's against our rules here in this after school program. We don't talk to kids that way. We don't text kids outside of the program. And I saw that you were doing that. And so you really need to stop that. And obviously some of these things, it might not just be, you need to stop. It might be like, we're going to have a meeting with your supervisor, or you're not going to be allowed to be working for this program anymore. There could be other consequences, but speak up, share what you're witnessing and what you're not okay with, reference policies. And whenever you can, I think it's a great idea to get other trusted adults to help you with these kinds of conversations, partly because it can just be less uncomfortable when we've got a little bit of backup and somebody else who's validating what we're saying. It also means if I've informed another adult about the thing I'm concerned about, now there's another adult paying attention to that situation, right? So the more eyes on the situation, the better. Okay, we are really nearing the end. I'm going to just give a few more concrete suggestions for what youth sports and after-school programs can be doing to prevent child sexual abuse. Some of these we have heard already today, but always good to be reminded. Ensure that all of your staff and volunteers can recognize grooming and can confidently intervene. You can schedule training with us at the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. You will have my contact information at the end of this training. Reach out if you are looking to bring somebody in to do a training like this. But doing a training one time is not going to make sure that everybody is actually truly good at recognizing these things or confident enough to intervene. These are topics that we have to revisit regularly with all of the adults that work in these programs. It doesn't mean you have to do a whole other multiple hour training, but we have a staff meeting every month. We're going to practice a few scenarios of what would I say if I wasn't sure that the way people were treating each other was okay. Widely publicize how staff, families, or participants could report sexual harassment or abuse. This is not a prevention strategy because if it's already happened, we have not prevented it, but it's good for organizations and programs to do. And it helps, I think, build a little bit of confidence amongst the kids, their families, the employees, that this is something that your organization takes seriously. And I think having anonymous options for reporting are also really important. So if there's a way to include that and share that with everybody, I would do that as well. We talked about this a little bit already. We should establish clear policies to minimize opportunity for child sexual abuse. So key to these policies should be eliminating or reducing one-on-one situations between children or between children and adults. How are we creating more group situations or having multiple adults supervise whenever possible? And another good thing to build into your policies, or at least your organization's protocols and procedures, is all interactions, if there are going to be one-on-one interactions, because that's just the nature of the program, like maybe it's a tutoring program and sometimes people need to have one-on-one conversations with people. All of those interactions should be able to be observed and interrupted. So they should never be happening in a room where the door is closed and nobody can see into the room, and it would be really difficult for somebody to observe what's going on, right? If it's going to be a little bit more secluded, then we need to have planned like check-ins or interruptions to what's going on there. Do an environmental scan. So this is more about like the physical environment where your program is happening. Are there areas that are really, really secluded and it would be really difficult for any adult to know what's going on if people were spending time in that area? If that's the case, can you change that? Or can you just make it known that that's not an area that people are allowed to be in when we're having practice or when we're here for after school program? So just look into what are the hidden secluded areas and see what you can do to fix that. Get creative about sharing your values with staff, participants, and families. Oh, this one's in here twice for some reason. Okay, that's it. Those are all my concrete suggestions. These are my final thoughts for you all today before I give you my contact information. Preventing child sexual abuse is all of our responsibility. Every single adult in every single community, no matter what kind of environment we work in, it is our responsibility to keep kids safe. This is an issue that affects your coworkers, the participants in your program, their families. Just because people aren't talking all the time about child sexual abuse does not mean that people are not affected by this, probably in ways that we're not even always thinking about. And I feel there are a lot of benefits to showing to the families, the kids, your coworkers, your employees, showing everyone that you and your organization care about preventing child sexual abuse. It's going to help people feel safer in these programs. The partnerships that you can develop specifically with your local sexual assault crisis center, there's opportunities for lots of other partnerships just outside of them. Those partnerships are going to potentially bring you in new like participants and families and people that want to partake in your program and open all kinds of new doors for initiatives and fundraising and campaigns, and just those partnerships can be really valuable. And ultimately, the reason I'm guessing we are all here today, we will be protecting the children that are in our programs. So I hope all this information sits with you, the power that you have, the responsibility that we all have, and I hope it feels like there's some tangible things that your program can do to make things safer for kids. I would love to help any program undertake any of the things that we have talked about today, or get you connected to your local sexual assault crisis center, who might also be a good partner for thinking through some of these changes or some of this work. So please, please, please contact me, email me if you need some support getting started, if you're not sure where to start, if there's other information or materials or training or anything that you need, please let me know. And I know we're just about at time, but if anybody has any questions or comments to close out today, please put them in the chat or unmute and share. And I really appreciate everybody being here today. Oh, and Yvonne, could you drop the evaluation link? Thank you. Perfect. So if folks have a second to click on the evaluation link and fill that out, I would greatly appreciate that as well.